The Eight of Swords, despite its rather busy appearance, is actually quite a simple card in its symbology. It is known as interference, and because we are here in the space of the mind, interference is something of which we are all familiar with. On the Rider-Waite card we can see the character is literally tied up and blindfolded, and so they are unable to figure out which way to go because they cannot see which path would lead them out of the imprisonment of which they find themselves in, even though it turns out if they simply walked straight forward they would be able to escape from this prison. On the Tree of Life we are ruled by Hod. Now Hod is quite low down on the actual Tree of Life, and so the energy of which we have got from Kether at the top, and also the energy from Mercury, because Hod is ruled by Mercury, is going to be weaker here. A suggestion that it's not quite as bright, of course it's not quite as strong as what it would be. However, it's not actually that grim. Because of the space this is and the paths of which come through it, one could say it is the start of being able to move back forward again. So if we've been ill and our body starts to fight whatever is wrong with us, we may feel very bad because of the symptoms of which that's actually giving us, and yet it is actually the start of us improving. It's the start of what is going to, in the end, allow us to get back on our feet again. Astrologically, the card is Jupiter in Gemini, and this is quite interesting as Jupiter is very expansive, and yet it's actually in its detriment in Gemini. Now it is the ruler of Sagittarius. It's a full 180 degrees around this zodiac wheel away from its home, and so it's the furthest it can be from its comfort zone, if you like, in that regard. And so what this means is that all of the energy of Gemini that we have, which of course is a duality type of energy, has affected the expansiveness and the potential for expansion that we see in Jupiter, and so the energy has been scattered into different elements and to different corners of the Earth, and so it's not quite as strong again as what it would be. It's also of note here that Mercury rules Gemini, and Hod on the Tree of Life is ruled by Mercury, and so we see them all joined together here. And because Hod is in Yetzirah, in the Sphere of the Swords cards, that's the world of course of formation, the physical world, we're actually seeing the splendour of Hod and the powers of Gemini and Mercury, of which are all connected to there, dropping down into this physical world of which sees distraction and torment and deception. It's the world of phantasms and of fantasy, and the world of time and of death. And so because of that, we start to become very confused, of course, in this card, and we just don't know where to go. We have two large swords down the centre of the card, and these are different, of course, to what we saw back on the Seven of Swords, where we had the one central sword, showing that we know where we want to go, but we're just not sure how to actually make it happen. Here we don't actually know where to go to at all, because we're torn between these two different possibilities, almost like the fork in the road, and we don't know which way to take. There are no signs to say, this is the way to our destination, and there comes a time when we will have to decide which road to go down. Otherwise, of course, we would decay, we would not move forward at all. And this type of thing can make us very much doubt our journey to begin with. Returning to Hod, that splendour could in this regard be about pretentiousness and a type of facade of success, a type of makeup of which we wear for the world, that we know that when we remove, we look very different. And so it's a lack of being true to ourselves, and with it a lack of persistence, certainly with regards to the mind and the powers of the will. Just as we saw with the previous card, in order to get somewhere, we have to know where we're going in the first place, and so these two swords show that we really don't know where we're going. The other swords crossing over them represent the different mental interferences and patterns of the mind of which are stopping us and pulling us in different directions. Now, these are actually rather interesting. Firstly, they're a lot shorter than the long swords of which we have seen all the way through the swords cards, and so these show that the thoughts that are causing interference are firstly less important. They are not the large issues, and yet they are that chatter of the mind of which we also see with that chaotic background in the card yet again. All of the small things that are basically attacking our presence and our power of targeted will. As for how these thoughts would actually show in our mind, the swords themselves can point something towards this, in that they are actually the different swords of various different countries. So we see a kukri, for example, and a dagger, machete, that type of thing. Now, they all do the same thing in principle. They are a sword, and so they will cut and stab and make you bleed. And yet their shape and their patterns are culturally imprinted with where they come from. And so with regards to those thoughts in our mind causing interference, it shows that the interference can come from outside ourselves and be formed and shaped by the cultures of where we come from. And so we may subconsciously cause interference because of the religion of our youth, for example, or because of some torment of which has happened in the home during our lives, and even simply because of our media-created identities, the avatars of which we put out to the world, especially today on the internet, which isn't us, and is expected to behave and to achieve and to look even in certain ways, of which isn't actually us behind that. And so all of these different swords, the different cutting implements of various cultures, are creating a crisscross going one way and of the other, so that in the end we don't know what is true, we don't know what we should be focusing on, and because of that we end up focusing on nothing at all. We are, like we saw with the astrological connotations, scattered in our actual mental state. And when we're scattered, of course, or we are distracted, nothing is actually done. In the Upanishads, we see a concept known as neti neti, of which means neither this nor that. And this type of concept can help us to understand how to break out of this state. And so this is about getting rid of everything of which is not of the highest universal principle, that ultimate reality of which lays behind everything. And so in the end, all of the different distractions and illusions of the physical world are abandoned because they are not of that true oneness of which lies behind all of these things, just as the true nature of all these swords is that they are a blade of which cuts. Their cultural connotations and their mythology and the folklore behind them may be very interesting, but in reality it is a blade of which cuts, and that is the truth of it. So we have crept behind the curtain, and there is no wizard. And so we have to say, well, what is it that we're seeing? And in order to get out of this crisscross of not knowing which way to go, we understand that it is the emotion, the heart, and the soul of something of which provides meaning to us, and not the actual thing itself. Somebody once said that we are all talking about how good a story is in something, such as a book or a movie or a game, and yet it's not actually the story that you're interested in, it's how it makes you feel, the emotion behind it. And so just like we hear, above all things, know thyself, it is that thyself, the real substance of your soul, of which feels and knows and is connected to all of these things. And this is why we go back to the astrological signs on this card now, because we have that aspect of Jupiter in Gemini. Jupiter is about growth and expansion, and yet because we're linked with Gemini, we're torn and we have too many decisions and too many paths. And so really it's about overthinking in some way, which is something I'm sure that many people are well aware of having done. It's analysing things too much or seeing things as all their different constituent parts and what they're made out of, rather than how they make us feel, rather than what they actually mean to us as a being living in this world. And so when you get this card, it really shows that you're going through this period where you just don't know what is the best option to take. And yet, because we've got that spirit of Hod and that spirit of wanting to expand but just not knowing which way to go, it's not actually all that negative. It shows that we can get out of this. So if the Rider-Waite character took off their blindfold, then they would see the way out. And so we have to get away from the situation that's putting us into this state of indecision. And we do that by looking for that optimism and that expansion that is there in Jupiter. And then we see that these small thoughts, which are symbolised by the swords here, are really quite unimportant, and they all do the same thing anyway when it comes down to it. So we leave them behind, and we get a new perspective on where we want to go, and we put the first step forward onto the path of which we have chosen to take.